Okay, so let's solve this question. The question states that in context of your owner and weak entity sets, the entity relationship data model, which one of the following statements is true? Okay, so we are discussing regarding ER diagrams. We are concerned with weak entity sets and owner entity sets. Okay, the options are mentioning which kind of terms. Weak entity sets must have total participation in identifying relationships. Okay, so we have to discuss these. Owner entity sets must have total participation identifying relationship. Then both of them have total participation. Okay, and then neither of them have total participation, must have total participation. Okay, so this is kind of the whole concept that is being expressed. So I have to first explain these terms and then we can get to that, right? First of all, ER diagrams, the basic gist of ER diagrams has to be understood, has to be revised actually. But obviously if you have, it has been some time and you have not looked into ER diagrams, I have provided a page regarding the symbols that I used in the ER diagram. You can go through that. I will provide the link to this PDF in the comments, right? I hope that you have gone through that and that part is revised. Now the ER diagrams are used for designing the schema, the fundamental schema of the databases. Schema is basically nothing but your design, right? So that designing part is done by ER diagrams, right, for the databases. So in ER diagrams, we are basically looking at the database from an abstract analysis point of view. Why? Because the actual instances of the database are not really viewed in your ER diagrams, right? How the tables of the database are actually organized and what their relationships are is basically discussed, but the actual data is not discussed. That is what ER diagrams are, right? But because they are referencing us owner and weak entity sets, this is concerned with the database part, right? Through reference of ER diagram, right? So basically the point that I'm trying to make is that owner entity set and weak entity sets and total participation identifying relationships, these concepts exist even without ER diagram and are database concepts which are represented in your ER model, right? That part, once I do hope, is very clear. First, your owner entity set is nothing but your normal entity set, right? An entity is basically a kind of object, which a real world object which can be uniquely identified, right? A collection of such entities is basically called an entity set, right? And a strong entity set is basically a strong entity set, an entity and an owner entity set are basically the same thing, right? The different concept over here is the weak entity set, right? Weak entity set is I will express you the idea how did we got till weak entity set. Let me give you an example for that, right? So this is a simple table constructed through MySQL. Now look at this. The table is of the employees and the employees have dependents, right? So the employee, this SN number is the key, that this SN number uniquely identifies all the entries, right? An entity set has unique entries and uniqueness can be classified by means of its attributes, right? A single attribute over here, SN number, is more than enough to basically provide distinction of every single entry of this table, right? But look closely. The Rohit and Sohit are basically siblings, right? So their dependents, right over here, I've basically considered their mothers, right? Sita is their mothers, right? So both of them have their dependents as same, and this Shubham, Shrey and some guy are basically, let's say that they are orphan, right? So their dependents are basically mentioned as null. Okay, very good. Now suppose for instance that you are collecting your organization has a preference of supporting the orphanages and training the orphan children and then employing them, right? If that is the case, hypothetical scenarios, right? In that situation, all of that data is going to be, most of your data is going, in which the dependents column is going to be filled with nulls. Is that not correct? Yes. So because your data is of this type, right? So in that situation, you can basically take this dependent, because a lot of entries of the dependents column is basically null, right? So why not take dependents as a separate entity, right? What will happen if you take dependents as a separate entity, right? Because as you can see, two entries of this column can be same. So by itself, it does not have the same entity set property that every single entry has to be completely distinct, right, and uniquely identifiable, right? So if that were to be the case, then you would have to make this different entity which does not have this normal common or everyday property of entity set, you would have to take the key of your employee table and put that in your dependents table also, right? If you were to do that, then and then only would that dependents entity be able to uniquely identify its entries. Obviously, it's not a big matter to remind you that if a table exists in which every single entity cannot be uniquely identified, then that duplicate redundant entry is basically useless because you can make no useful inferences from that, right? So that part is reminded. So these three null entities causing this dependence column to be made into a different entity set right over here, by itself its dependence part is not enough to uniquely identify its entries, right? So this whole entity set was considered a weak entity set, right? This is the fundamental concept of how weak entity sets came into picture. And because weak entity sets have to be useful, right, nothing in the database can be useless, right? So for that, a foreign key of a entity has to be introduced, right? And this foreign key is showing a relationship, right? This is a relationship that it is showing, right? So this relationship is known as identifying relationship, right? It is represented by the double diamonds, right? And this SN number is coming from right over here, right? So this is where the weak entity set concept comes from. And now the point is that the concept of weak entity sets is only present in the database so long as the employee data is actually present in the database. Suppose, for instance, that Rohit leaves the organization, right? So this entry is going to be removed, right? Now, suppose, for instance, that Sohit also leaves the organization. Now, this entry is also going to be removed, right? So, the company is concerned with Sita so long as an employee, right? An employee exists corresponding to Sita, right? So from the concerns of your company, from your company's concerns, the owner of the concerns regarding Sita of the company is your Rohit and Sohit, right? The concerns of the company is being analyzed over here, right? So this weak entity set has a existential dependency on your strong entity or simply entity, right? Or basically over here owner entity, right? The employee. This is the database concept, and that part is being present, right? So very good, very clearly visible. The thing about what I was trying to say is there could not be an entry with only Sita and this part being null, right? So for every single entry in your dependents column, there is going to be a corresponding employee, right? So from a weak entity set point of view, there is total participation. That is fundamental, because if there exists, suppose for example, right over here there exists some Geeta, right? And here it is null. So this is a void entry. This entry is problematic, right? So by the constraints of the scenario, the constraints of your database, this kind of entry is not possible. Hence, from point of view of your weak entity set, total participation is present. Why? Because its entry's existence is in a existential dependency to your strong entity set, through which you are related through an identifying relationship. This fundamental concept, I'm just expressing it to you in a revisionary kind of manner, right? So that is the whole thing. They are trying to judge that do you have developed this understanding regarding database, the concepts of the names, the nomenclature, do you have that understanding? That is the whole thing that they were checking, right? This was a database regarding question asked through means of your entity relationship diagram, right? So entity relation diagram is nothing but this thing, right? Here the tables is not present, right? The tables are not present. We are only representing that this kind of table is present, right? The employee has a identifying relationship. This is the has relationship with the dependents, right? And these two lines in your ER diagrams represents total participation, right? I do hope that this is very clear, and with that clear understanding, we can directly basically judge which of statements are correct. The weak entity set must have total participation in the identifying relationship, right? That is exactly the kind of case which exists, because if that were because there is an existential dependency, right? That is why this statement is true. So this existential dependency concept of weak entity sets is something that they are judging whether or not you know, right? The first statement is correct. The second statement says that the owner entity set must have total participation in the identifying relation. Not really. There is no requirement. Suppose for instance over here there is Shubham exists, right? There is no dependent corresponding to that, so there is total participation is not present, right? So this is not correct. Both weak and owner entity sets must have total participation. Not really, because B was not correct, so this is also not correct, right? And the fourth option is neither weak entity set nor owner entity set must have total participation. That is not correct, because A is correct, that weak entity set must have total participation, right? So D statement cannot be correct. This was a 1 mark question, very simple question, and I do hope this is kind of a thing, theory kind of question. Do you know the theory? Is the theory clear to you? Can you actually solve questions regarding that? Is something that is being checked, and I do hope that you learned something, and with that I will see you in the next video.